I'm joined today by Julia Hollenbery, and Julia is a practitioner of pleasure. And she'll probably describe herself in many different ways as we go through this episode. But the concept that we're talking about here is the word pleasure in all its kind of forms and guises. Before talking to and meeting Julia, I'm not really quite sure what I thought pleasure was. Julia has some very interesting perspectives on this, which we're going to explore through this conversation. I guess for me, pleasure was, before meeting and speaking to Julia, a kind of almost an output from an experience, and hopefully a good experience. But I think the way that Julia describes it and defines it is so much more. And I'm sure we're going to touch on things like being present, mindfulness, and pleasure in itself as we actually go through this conversation. So we're going to see where the conversation takes us. And obviously, a lot of this is going to be focused on Julia's upcoming book, which she is going to be telling us all about. So welcome to the episode, Julia.
Thank you very much, Neil.
So give the listeners a little bit of an insight as to who you are. If they haven't encountered you before, I'm sure they'll be quite intrigued as to, well, who would want to talk to us about pleasure?
So many different ways to answer the question, who am I? Well, fundamentally, I am a body worker. My background is as a therapist. I'm trained in quite a few schools of ways of working with people. And I'm an author, and I'm a mum, and I'm a woman, and I'm a friend. And right now, I'm here with you.
So the author part of things, how did that come about? Because I guess a lot of people say everyone's got a book in them. And I guess this must be a sort of a manifestation of many years of thinking, of plotting, of manifesting and sort of hoping that there might be a book within Julia. Is there a story and a background of the journey towards?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, as a child, I always knew that I would write a book. I always knew that I would write a book. And my life was not always easy. There were a lot of times that were difficult, and I certainly wasn't thinking or focusing about that. But half a lifetime ago, 25 years ago, I began writing the first part of this book. And that was a raw, emotional, probably a rant. And one poem from that draft has made it into the finished book. And then a few years ago, suddenly, I began writing, and it poured out of me morning and evening. Really, it passionately poured out of me. And it was really clear what was going into the book, except for one piece that I had to really reach to find. And that was a surprise for me too. And there were times when I was lost or in difficulty. And I remember then the fear that I wouldn't make it. I wouldn't make it to achieve this thing that I needed to do. And right now I am incredibly glad, grateful, delighted that I've had the opportunity to write it down and that it's going to be published and make it into the hands of readers.
It's a very interesting thing that you described there in terms of the moment, I guess, where suddenly it arrived. You know, to be that long in the making, it's almost that you've created this this kind of recipe, if you like, sort of many, many years ago, and almost put it in the slow cooker to kind of just brew and kind of, you know, get all the flavors kind of sort of beginning, and then suddenly it's there. Suddenly the actual, you know, sort of, you know, ingredients have come together, and the moment is right. What would have been the trigger for that moment? Because that's quite a long gap between the initial kind of concept and idea, and then it actually then really starting to flow. It's quite an interesting experience.
I guess it depends from where somebody is writing a book and what's the purpose in writing the book. And for me, it was really heeding something. It was always there, like I always knew it. So it's a good question that you ask, but I don't have an answer. I don't know. I don't know. It's not that something happened. It was just that the moment somehow suddenly was ripe, and a particular gate opened, and the manifesting process, the articulation process, the wrestling with the material, the connecting to the inspiration and to the reader, the great outpouring began. And yeah, it was really listening. And as I'm talking to you now, I've got my hands outstretched. It was really listening to, and in certain ways, kind of being obedient to that prompting and to that energy. And I had to wait until it was ripe to be done, I guess, through me.
And so different to the way, I guess, that most people would approach this. They would probably be thinking, right, I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to do this very kind of ego driven, not ego as in I'm boosting my ego, but just ego as in I'm in control of this. I can decide what I write, when I write. I'm going to sit there, pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, and I'm going to make it happen. What you're describing is very much the other end of the spectrum, isn't it? Where it was, and to use your words, an outpouring of the moment, really, when actually everything just kind of felt right. It's kind of a description of being very, very present, isn't it, in the moment, and just being, as you say, very receptive to the energy flow at that time. It's a very, very different approach, I'm imagining, to how most people would imagine that if they were to start the journey of being an author, would actually be.
I guess that there's probably many, many, many different ways to go about writing a book. And they're probably all valid and valuable. And I imagine that everyone in the process will go through that up and down that you go through of creativity, of being lost, of losing hope, of having to stay focused, you know, of where is the inspiration, right? I bet you there's nobody, not even someone who's written the most linear and structured business book, that probably hasn't gone through something of that journey, because creativity, as we know, right? Creativity is always that wrestle with the soul, you know, something is coming through. So even if people think they're going to do it one way, I bet you that everybody at some point has to come into contact with the mystery, contact with the finding out, you know, because, yeah.
It is a journey, I mean, for sure. And I think, you know, my experience of writing was a very, very different sort of experience. I had a lot of information to impart rather than it being about a concept, as it were. This was very much about sort of education, if you like, of something that was already defined. So a very different kind of perspective. But I'm very interested to kind of explore kind of literally the how it manifested. So use the word manifesting there. This whole idea of pleasure. Describe to us how the idea of pleasure sort of came about for you, because it is obviously from your practice, and being a body worker, there's a whole range and a whole, set of different sort of elements that you'll encounter. So why pleasure?
Again, it wasn't a linear process. And the original title of the book was The Universe of Deliciousness, which is what I'm writing about and evoking and inviting readers into. When I was small, perhaps like many other people, I couldn't understand the way that the adults or the world was talking about things. There seemed to be so very much obligation and pressure, and you must do this and you ought to do this, and distortions and things that didn't seem fair or right to me. Or I remember being in the garden as a child. The garden was really my home. And of course, it was very beautiful. The huge blue sky, the green grass, the texture of the bark of the willow tree, the insects at the bottom of our garden were golden wheat fields up to the horizon. It was a very sensual place to be. And I always had a sense that there was so much more pleasure that was possible for everybody to live, that life didn't need to be as squashed and as stressed and as complicated as it seemed to me then that it was. So it's a thread that's always been with me.
Yeah, it's interesting there when you're describing that. It feels like it's got a sort of multisensual. So every sense getting involved in this experience, I guess. So I mean, being a body worker, you're obviously very in tune with nature, very in tune with surroundings, very in tune with energies. Do you find that the people that you kind of work with are kind of almost seeking this clarity, if you like, because it's very different to the chaotic world that most of us are kind of living in, particularly right now? Do you find that this whole idea and this whole kind of essence behind the idea of pleasure and seeking of pleasure is about creating that clarity and that kind of connection with something greater than just self?
So I pause on the word seeking pleasure. I think most people are seeking peace, are seeking contentment, are seeking ease in their body, are seeking simple happiness in relationship, in their work, in their home life, in their life in general, in their body. The culture at large, the idea of seeking pleasure is really greedy. It's based on, I'll squash myself now and do this thing that I'm supposed to do or that I ought to do. Once I've got it finished, then I'm deserving of getting some pleasure. So my sense of pleasurableness is that it's not one fixed thing. And it's not, of course, a constant state. It's about finding the pleasurableness within everything. And as we know, life is constantly changing. It's constantly in flux. And the pleasurableness is possible all of the time when we turn our attention towards it. There's different kinds of pleasurableness. And I think when clients on the table experience their body more fully, have a much more sensual, somatic, embodied experience, they are, of course, delighted. And we all know that it's there, right? We all have a sense But there's so much more than we're usually living.
There's a couple of things I want to kind of explore there in the way that you described it. One was the simplicity. So that's a really interesting word from my perspective, this whole idea of simplicity, because I think a lot of people, and I probably in the past would have put myself into this category, if you were to define what pleasure is, it's quite a complex thing. There's a lot to it. And it has to feel good, and it's a big thing. Whereas actually the way you're describing it is it's taking things almost back to their purest essence. It's the simplest of simple things, little moments, little observations that actually bring the most pleasure. Am I kind of hearing you correctly in that?
Yeah, I think so. So let's just do a little tiny experiment right now. If you take your two fingers, your two hands, and you bring two fingers to touch each other, and you just bring your attention to the sensation of your fingertips touching each other. That's kind of fun, right? In a small way. And the sense is that there is pleasure possible in the interaction between any two things. So right now, you and I are having a conversation. We don't know what we're going to say next. We've got absolutely no idea what's going to happen. But at least for me, this is not just the exchange of information for the sake of the audience. This is also about you and I having a spontaneous meeting and seeing what might happen in this space. And that's where fun lies, that's where pleasure lies. And in a way, it doesn't matter what the two things meeting are. It can be this moment, my foot on the carpet and the sensations there, or it can be when I bite into something delicious, or kind of anything.
I like this. I really like the way this conversation's going, because I think, yeah, there is something that is just so achievable, and I constantly sort of find myself saying about this phrase seeking pleasure, because I think it is a natural habit for human beings. We've been programmed this way. It's probably not in the DNA, but socially, I think we've been programmed to seek this stuff. Whereas actually what you're saying is, no, it's all around you. Just wake up, people, is actually what I think what you're probably saying, but you've phrased it so much more eloquently. But I think ultimately that is the phrase that you're saying, is just wake up to the moment, wake up to the surroundings, just wake up to everything, because you don't need to go out and find this. It's actually right here, right now, in this moment.
Yep, I'm really delighted and smiling broadly to hear this description reflected back to me. I noticed that my hand is actually caressing my leg as part of my own response. And I've forgotten the next bit that I was going to say. There was something else that you said. Yeah, yes, that's it. It isn't really complicated. It is about a choice to allow ourselves to have pleasure amongst the stress and the difficulty. And sometimes it's about something external, like giving ourselves the resource to have a delicious cup of coffee with cream added, right? That's just sumptuous, as opposed to coffee with milk, or whatever it is that switches you on. And it is holding that space to allow yourself to be with whatever is happening right now. And then it changes, then it shifts, then it turns, and it becomes something else. And that's delightful.
And it's, I think, for a lot of people who would probably describe themselves as energy workers in their whole, the whole gambit of different sort of styles of the way that happens, is that they're treating, they're helping, mentoring, coaching, influencing people who possibly perceive that they have some real fundamental challenges in their lives. So they might be grieving, they might have significant loss, they might have some real health issues. What you're describing as pleasure, though, is completely, again, if I get it right, completely achievable, even in the darkest of times, because it's in the moment. There isn't something you have to go somewhere to receive pleasure. You don't have to change your mental state to receive pleasure. You can just take it in that moment. Is that right?
It is right. And it is right. And it's also not a whitewashing of the great difficulty when one is in the great difficulty. It's not a skipping over of the difficulty and a thinking that one can just press a button and it will vanish. You know, I think we all forget the great privilege that we have in being alive in a body on this planet. And everything is an experience to be experienced. So what you're saying is right. I'm just hesitant of it sounding glib, because when one is in the difficulty, one is in the difficulty, and it hurts and it's painful. And there is a way inside difficulty for pain to transform into pleasure, but it's not something quick, fast, glib, but it absolutely is possible, even in the simplest terms of breathing more, taking more breath. And things can be transformed.
So the way that this conversation feels like it's kind of morphing, and I really like it, the fact that we have done no preparation. People can probably hear that we've done no preparation, but I think that's the beauty of this. It was always going to be this way for the right reasons, because if this was like an interview, I think we'd be done and dusted by now, but there's just so many little pathways we could sort of take, you know, this conversation. And to me, it is about this thing about being present. I know I keep saying it, and I find myself keep saying it, but it's just so important in this whole concept, because it's almost that pleasure as an idea, as a construct, is there almost as a positive kind of delight of something that you've done consciously. I'm trying to explain this another way, is if you kind of take in sort of, I don't know, traditional kind of sort of Buddhism sort of philosophy would say that, you know, things aren't necessarily good or bad, they're just what they are. So there is just this beautiful neutral that kind of sits in the center of everything. And so you can have yin yang, you can have, you know, positive, negative, you can have good and bad, dark and light, and all of these things. But ultimately, everything kind of comes back to this calm neutrality at the center. With pleasure, it's obviously, well, to my definition of it, and I think the way you're describing it, it's skewed towards the positive. It's skewed towards the delicious experience, to use your words. What happens on the other side? Well, what is the kind of the yin and yang thing that's going on with pleasure? Because I've always challenged with this. It's a rhetorical question, because to me, it's a really profound one. And I've always struggled with this, is that as a humanity, if we're all going towards seeking of pleasure, seeking of good things, seeking of the positive in everything, if everything naturally in the universe balances back to zero, where's the negative if we're all focusing on pleasure? What happens if we all focus on pleasure? Now that's a tricky one. I don't expect you to even answer that one.
Ways I can go in response to that. I guess in a way, the kind of pleasure that I'm talking about is more in the unification space, and it's like things melt into the pleasurableness. So it's a factor of being sensitive. So being sensitive means that one is more sensitive to the pain. And one is more sensitive to the pleasure. So it's more kind of allowing the pleasure, being receptive to the pleasure, choosing pleasure rather than seeking pleasure. Because the seeking pleasure in a way is a kind of, or choosing pleasure, being open to pleasure. Because seeking pleasure, I think, has got a lot of doing energy in it. Again, you know, I've got to do this thing that I don't want to do, and then afterwards I will go and reward myself with some sweet treat, whatever it may be. Yeah, I mean, it's not that problems disappear or challenges vanish. A life always has ups and downs. But the enfolding, the inclusion of pleasure or pleasurableness acts as a resource when things are hard. It's a ballast, and it's a way of life, and it's an experience, and it's a delight. It's our nature.
Yeah, you've just highlighted something which I hadn't actually remembered for a long, long time, and we're talking years and years and years. But ever since I was a child, and certainly growing up through adulthood, people have, at various points, been quite curious and actually quite challenging of me when I've said, I don't really want to celebrate that. It's fine, just the doing. I just want to move on to the next thing. And people have said in a number of different scenarios and guises, when I've kind of done something, maybe achieved with a small a something, and they say, well, do you want to go out and celebrate? No. And oh, you don't look very happy now you've got it. No, was always my response. It's like, no, because I'm on to the next thing now. The pleasure came from on the journey. It wasn't the end destination. I don't need to go out for a meal. I don't need to buy myself a shiny object, because actually that wasn't why I was doing it. But interestingly, and so that for me is just, I can remember being in childhood and actually going through that. So thank you for reminding me that. It's a really nice thing that just makes me me. So thank you for sort of bringing that one around. I had not thought of that in years. But for me, it raises a big, big question, which is all around the whole idea of, this is probably going slightly off topic, but it is related, the whole idea of actually setting, goal setting, if you like, in life, and actually having a life plan that is set with markers and milestones that are, in essence, really rewards, pleasurable rewards for things that you do. And a lot of people, coaches, mentors, bosses at work, will always say, oh, there's a reward at the end of this. If you do it like this, then you'll get a return. If you invest something, invest money, buy shares or whatever, there's a return. But actually, the way you're describing it feels like I don't have to wait until something happens probably outside of my control in the future. I've got it right here, right now. That feels much better. That feels much more tangible. It feels much more real. It's more simple. But actually, well, why do I then? And I just want to pick up and just highlight to anybody listening the words that you used, which might have gone sort of unnoticed for some people, but I spotted them sort of as you said them, the difference between being and doing. Because if you're doing the being, if you are the being, then you can feel pleasure. If you do too much doing, then you're distracted. It's quite hard to do pleasure when you're doing, much easier to do pleasure when you're being.
but it's difficult, right? Those are really abstract concepts when you're being. How do you do being, right? You know, that's hard, right? And I would say that there can be a lot of pleasure in the doing, right? You're doing a physical task of moving the fridge outside, right? Or moving the furniture around. And there is pleasure inside of that, right? The body can feel really good as you stretch and as you move, as you achieve the thing, as you create something new. There is pleasurableness inside that. And many people enjoy their work. They're passionate about what they do. They want to make a contribution. But what gets in the way of the office dynamics and the management and the this and the, you know, in the old days, there's stress on the trains, and it's all that stuff that gets in the way. But for many people, not for everybody, of course, but for many people, the actual work can be a pleasure, almost as if everyone would just go away and leave me alone, and I could get on with doing my thing and enjoy doing it and be satisfied at the end, or cooking a meal, right? There's a pleasure in choosing what you're going to make and selecting your vegetables and handling the vegetables, you know, a nice chunky courgette in your hand, the colors of the green, the shiny skin, the tomatoes, right? All of it, the hiss of the oil in the pan, right? My mouth is salivating as I'm describing this to you. So actually there is pleasure in the doing. It's not at all that doing is bad and, you know, but it is bringing yourself to notice those details of things, to notice that the body feels really good, or, you know, the hands feel really good touching something, or the eyes are appreciating what they're taking in, the aromas of the cooking, you know. So doing can really be pleasurable. It's allowing ourselves to have the pleasurableness within the doingness.
And being kind to ourselves, it seems to be a phrase that just appears everywhere. I'm seeing it, you know, in the media. People of friends and family are talking about being kind to yourself. It's possibly something that's been reflected back to me right now. I don't know, but I'm seeing it and experiencing that quite a lot. That's really what we're talking about here, isn't it? It is kindness ultimately.
It's kindness. It's realizing that we, you, me, us, are worthy, are good enough, of having a good time. You know, it's really simple. And yes, of course, being kind to ourselves, but with any of these, when we're caught up in stuff, it's kind of hard to do, you know, and then you can get caught in, oh, I'm supposed to be being kind to myself, and how do I do that? And then you end up, so, yeah, I mean, it's like being gentle with oneself, or slow with oneself, or considerate of oneself, or including oneself. I'm just looking for other ways to say the same thing. Yeah, to break the being kind to oneself down into perhaps more practical ways of doing that. It's allowing, it is having fun amongst what needs to get done. You know, it's kind of like playing within the structure, and we all have structures, we all have time frames, we all have tasks, we all have whatever it is. And within that, we can make a bit of play, make a bit of space, make a bit of time, make a bit of exploration, make a bit of kindness.
Having fun in amongst what needs to be done. That's going to be my takeaway of this conversation. I think it is that simple, isn't it? Really, it is that simple.
Yeah, and it takes remembering or mindfulness or practice or awareness or choosing, right? To come back to that, to remember, because when we're stressed, when we're holding our breath, when we're tensing our shoulders, when we're compressing our bodies and going as fast as we can to get the task done, it's hard to remember ourselves amongst the task. So it's choosing and choosing and choosing again to notice. And even if what we're noticing is that, yeah, the shoulders are raised, or there's this sensation or that sensation, it's kind of fun also to notice all that stuff, or to dance in the kitchen while you're cooking your meal, or, you know, while you're typing your email, to have a little wriggle on your chair, and that might feel good, or whatever it is.
So it's being alive, isn't it? It's actually, I think, because you started the conversation by saying it is about being aware that we have this honor, and being really grateful of being in a body, you know, on a planet, experiencing with all the senses everything that's going on around and within us. That's it, isn't it? It is that definition of being alive, having fun with what needs to be done. Yeah, it's just got some lovely quotes there. Are there lots of quotes in the book? Lots of things people can take away and almost build as mantras for themselves.
I think the book is pretty rich, actually. There's a lot of quotes from other authors who've said the same things throughout history and geography. There's a lot of references to science as well as therapy and spirituality. And there's the way that I'm saying it. So I hope people will find it nourishing and interesting and delightful, and will use it to, go.
I was just going to say, how are people getting hold of this then? So I believe it's available right now to pre-order.
It's available apparently everywhere, booksellers everywhere, to pre-order now. And it will land in your hands in the middle of October, or be on the shelves in bookshops in the middle of October. The Healing Power of Pleasure, 7 medicines for rediscovering the innate joy of being.
So Julia, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm going to go away now and be very present, I think, for the rest of the day. And I think I'm going to be probably smiling externally and internally about some of these ideas, and just noticing the little moments when the tips of my fingers make contact, because it was as simple as that. I love that little exercise, because that just brings us back to the simplicity of this. So Julia, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really, really interesting journey with you.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's been fun hanging out with you.